bienvenidos a otro video de Español 2. Welcome to another Spanish 2 video. Yo soy Señor Juliot y yo estoy aquí para los apuntes de verbos irregulares. I'm here to talk about irregular boot verbs in Spanish. First off, sorry for the informal Baby Yoda where I wasn't sure I was doing a video today. So, we are talking about this week something called, well, it's called two different things sometimes. Sometimes we refer to these as stem changing verbs, but they also have a nickname, and that is boot verbs. So, what we mean by a stem-changing verb is that, remember a verb is an action, and in Spanish all of these end in AR, ER, or IR. And when we conjugate these particular verbs, these what we call stem-changing verbs, the stem of the verb, which is the beginning part, also changes. The reason we call it a boot verb is because it only changes sometimes, just to make things a little bit confusing, right? So, there are three types of stem-changing or boot verbs. There are verbs that when you conjugate it, the O changes to a UE. There are verbs that change from an E to an IE when you conjugate it, and verbs that change from an E to an I. Now there is one verb, one that's very commonly used, so it's pretty important, that changes from a U to a UE, but it's kind of the same thing. Let's take a look at our conjugation chart. Right, remember we have 6 subjects in Spanish when we conjugate a verb. Remember you just took a test on this. You have yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros, vosotros, ellos, ellas, ustedes. Now, when you take one of these stem-changing verbs, one of these verbs that's irregular, and you conjugate it, so let me give you an example. The verb dormir. Dormir is a very important verb. It means to sleep, right? That is an action that we do fairly frequently. We talk about it quite a bit. So it's fairly important that you know that word. Dormir is a stem-changing verb. This O changes to a UE when you conjugate it. So let me show you. If I want to say, I sleep, they do not say dormo. It is duermo. The O changes to a UE. You sleep. Tú duermes. He, she, it, or you, formal, sleeps. Él, ella, usted, duerme. Before you get too used to this, watch. Nosotros dormimos. Dormimos. The O does not change to a UE. When we say we sleep, vosotros dormís. Again, the O does not change to a UE when we say y'all sleep. Now, fortunately, we don't use vosotros very much. Now, the last form, just to make things a little bit more confusing again, ellos duermen. The O does change to a UE. This is where the nickname boot verbs comes in handy. We call this a boot verb because if you draw an outline around the subjects, around the forms that are irregular, you get the shape of a boot. That is a terrible looking boot, I understand. But hopefully you get the idea. The yo, tú, él, usted, the ellos form are all irregular. Nosotros and vosotros do not do that stem change. So, that is an O to UE verb. We're going to kind of zip through examples of the other one, and hopefully through practice you can kind of understand. So, the U to UE verb that does this, you are hopefully familiar with this verb. It is jugar. Jugar is to play a game or a sport. And it is U to UE when you conjugate. If I want to say I play, it is juego. You play, juegas. He or she plays, juega. Nosotros, we play, jugamos. Vosotros, jugáis. Ellos, ellas, ustedes, juegan. All right, I'm going to give you two more examples. One from each of the other type. So I said there are also verbs that change from E to IE, and verbs that change from E to I. Now it's pretty obvious when a verb has an O as opposed to an E, which type of verb it is or how it's going to change. But obviously here it's a little different because both of these have an E changing to something else. How do you know the difference? You really can't. You're just going to have to memorize, unfortunately. Fortunately, there are very few verbs, or there are not as many verbs that change from just E to I, and there are very few that we're going to expect you to know this year in Spanish too. So, an example of an E to IE, straight off of your vocab list, is the verb perder. Perder means to lose in Espanol. Unfortunately, that is part of sports, so it's part of our vocab. When you conjugate perder in our 6 forms, it changes to an IE, that E does. So we have, talking like Yoda, pierdo, I lose. Pierdes, you lose. Pierde, he or she loses. Perdemos, we lose. Perdéis, y'all lose. Pierden, they lose. So, again, boot. Perdemos, perdéis. The other one's pierdo. Pierdes, pierde. Okay. One more example. We're going to do an E to I, and we're going to stay with your vocab, because it makes sense. The verb competir. Kind of important with sports. Sorry about that. Kind of important with sports. Talking about to compete. This is an example of one that changes from an E to an I, and it is obviously this letter right here that changes. So, writing it out real quick for you. I compete, the E changes to an I when we add our ending. Compito. You compete. Compites. Él, usted. Compite. Nosotros competimos. Vosotros competís. Ellos, ellas, ustedes compiten. Once more. Boot. And my marker's dying. But you get the idea. All right. Couple of really quick examples, I guess. I find my class. You lose the match. I ask for pizza. I use the same subject twice, but whatever. Okay, this is not working out that well as a prop. Encontrar is to find. I think that's on your vocab, on the list of verbs. Lose is from your vocab list, and then I ask the verb. In case it isn't, I'm pretty sure it is though on your list of verbs to know, is pedir, and it is an E to I. So just practice conjugating those in the context real quick. Pause it if you need to, and resume. Okay. First one, yo encuentro mi clase. You lose the match. Tú pierdes el partido. Maybe you looked up match on your vocab list. Partido. I ask for pizza. Yo pido la pizza. Or just pizza. It's fine. Bien. Now, if we change the subject of this first one, I find, to we find, it would probably be our class then, I guess, or the class. Remember, you would not do the O to UE. It would be encontramos. And you do not change that O to a UE. So, there are the list of verbs that's on Schoology if you are virtual. Otherwise, you should get that list in class of verbs that fall under each of these categories, and hopefully this concept makes sense to you. Those verbs are important ones that you really need to know and you will be tested on. Okay, that's the end of this video. Gracias.